international relationships impacted the course of the pandemic? So in trying to answer those, I'm going to give you a framework from international relations that allows us to ask different questions and look for different pieces of evidence. And that way we can turn over a bunch of different stones, look in a lot of different places, and really get hopefully a fairly full picture of some of the things that have happened since March, right? Okay, so how can we make sense of the news? Also, go ahead and note that I have a lot of artwork in this slide from this one Polish artist. And so if you're interested in him or in any of the news articles that I'll talk about, I've got notes for the slides, and in the notes section, you can find all of those URLs. And I put the link for the slides in the chat already. Okay, so I told you that I was going to give you a framework for explaining international relations. There are a bunch of big umbrellas or tents for different approaches to thinking about world politics. We're going to go through 4 of them today, time permitting. So realism, liberalism, constructivism, and critical theories. So I'm going to walk you through the basics of what these approaches are about and what they look for, and then we're going to apply it to the pandemic. Okay, so the first one is realism. Realism is pretty pessimistic, right? So if you're kind of a pessimistic person, you might like realism. So realism looks at world politics and it's predicting, it is thinking about states going into conflict. And that conflict can take many forms, but realism is mostly concerned with war. So it's a way of looking at world politics that emphasizes the struggle for power, particularly military power, hard power, and dominance among states. So we're already thinking kind of pessimistically here. We're thinking about states wanting to dominate each other, having more power than each other, and wanting to be on top, right? So realists assume that states or countries act rationally in pursuit of their interests, and they assume that all states want to continue to survive as their main interest and to maintain their security. Right? Now, we draw on many classical authors for realism. One of them is Hobbes, and you guys might remember Hobbes from some point during your school. The main phrase that we remember from Hobbes is that life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. And I told you it was pessimistic. So nasty, brutish, and short is describing for Hobbes the state of nature. And realists make the leap to say that the world is in the state of nature because there is no world government, right? We're in a state of anarchy, which means there is no world government. If a state gets in trouble, there's no 911 for the state to call, they're on their own, right? And so following the ideas from Hobbes then, and a lot of other authors too, they're predicting that states are gonna wanna look out for themselves, watch their own backs, and that means that they're gonna be building up their militaries. And that means that conflict, it's kind of inevitable. Okay. So this is the logic of realism that I just laid out for you. So states are the main actors. We exist in anarchy, right? There's no world government. That means that there's a self-help system. There are all the states trying to help themselves because nobody else is going to help them, or at least they can't trust anybody else to help them. And that leads to a security dilemma where anything that I build up to protect myself, you guys might be threatened by. Right? So I might build up a bunch of tanks, but then if Carolyn is my neighbor, which she actually is in real life, then Carolyn sees all my tanks and she is scared and she wants to build up her tanks too. Okay, so realism is predicting this one-upmanship that is an arms race, right? Okay. Now, thinking about the pandemic, it's kind of an interesting story, a kind of interesting thing to try and think about with realism because we haven't seen that much conflict outright. But still, realism is going to give us some interesting ways to think about some of the things that have happened in the news since March. All of these articles are dealing with the United States kind of being a jerk. Right? The US has decided that we are going to forgo the rest of the world and kind of go out on our own. So the first one says, right, the US blocks a vote on the UN's bid for global ceasefire over reference to the WHO, the World Health Organization. So the US has decided that we no longer want to work with the World Health Organization, that we're pulling out, that we're going to stop funding for it. And so we're even going so far as to not sign a ceasefire resolution in the UN because it references the World Health Organization. The US has also gone out on its own, and the second article, this is back in June, of securing the world stock of a particular drug that it thought would be useful for fighting the disease, right? So trying to have relative power, you might say, take the world stock of a drug and not give it to anyone else. The third one says the US won't join global coronavirus vaccine effort because it's led by the World Health Organization, right? So this one, same thing, because of the feud with the World Health Organization, wanting to go out on its own and not really worry about the rest of the world too much. Now, all of this is pretty sad, maybe it's pessimistic, but it also very much fits with realism's expectations, right? That states are on their own, they're looking out for themselves, and this is how you behave if you're irrational. Right? Now, part of the rub of this is that you also have to worry about other states, right? Now, the US is usually still considered to be the most powerful country in the world, but we are weakening, realists would say, because of the rise of China. And so there are plenty of articles that you can look at that have come out since March, suggesting that this dynamic, right, this competition between these two major powers has worsened because of the pandemic, because the US is weakening because of the disease and because of pulling out of these international institutions. China is taking its place, right, and becoming richer and becoming more involved in the world. So several articles here pointing to that, one from The Economist, one from Vox. The last one is A Duck of Minerva, which I know is a silly name. It's a blog that's run by political scientists, right? So international relations scholars go there, they write about stuff, and that article, right, is getting at some of the things that international relations scholars are worried about, right? Accelerating the power transition between the US and China. Now, this is not just bad because like, oh, whoa, maybe we're worried about the United States. It's bad for international relations scholars in particular, because one of the theories behind realism, or one of the sub-theories, is that when a rising power is closing in on the big power, the hegemon, that's when you're most likely to see conflict. And so if it's true that the pandemic has accelerated this process of China getting closer to the power of the United States, then realists would predict that that's making conflict between the two more likely and making the world generally more unstable. One final article for realism before we move on. So I told you that the US is having a beef with the World Health Organization right now. The World Health Organization in this article is sending out a warning, right, against vaccine nationalism, against states wanting to produce a vaccine but keep it for themselves and not work with other states. Realism would predict that, right, because having a vaccine at this point is a form of security and they are all looking out for themselves. The World Health Organization is an intergovernmental organization where states come together, right, to work on issues. Of course, they don't want this. They don't want the states to all work on their own. They want the states to work together. So the World Health Organization has warned against this. This particular article is talking about Russia largely, right? So the US has kind of been a jerk and going at them on its own, and so has Russia. Okay, that's realism. Let's move on and think about liberalism. So this theory, or this paradigm, this perspective on international politics, starts out kind of similar to realism. It has some of the same assumptions. It's looking mainly at states as the big actors, and it's assuming that states are rational as well. But in this one, it says that cooperation is a good thing and cooperation is possible. It's more optimistic than realism. And in fact, it looks at, in particular, I would say 3 components that liberalism argues makes peace more possible, makes cooperation and peaceful relationships more possible. We're drawing on these from Immanuel Kant, so another theorist, political theorist. So particularly domestic politics are going to be important, right? And particularly for liberals, the more democracies in the world, the better. Interdependence is important for having peace, right? So that's particularly thinking about trade, and the more that states trade with each other, the more likely peace is going to be, because if you're trading with each other, you don't want to go to war because it would hurt you too, right? So we would like interdependence because it makes war less likely. And finally, institutions too. And by this, we mean the kind of things like the World Health Organization, international organizations, and international law. All right, so all of these for liberals are going to make peace more possible. So if we have this perspective and look at news since March, we'll look at some different things. Actually, we can go back and look at the same article we were thinking about realism with and have a different take on it. Because when we think about institutions being important for peace, for liberals, it's not any old institution, it's good institutions, right? And so you might ask for liberals, well, if they think that institutions are so important, why has the World Health Organization been so criticized? Why has the World Health Organization not had a bigger role in the pandemic? Why has it not been able to do more? Well, like I said, liberals would say quality matters here, right? The World Health Organization operates on a budget that's about the size of one major US hospital. World Health Organization, one major US hospital, roughly the same budget. And so taking that into consideration, the World Health Organization actually does a lot. It's actually kind of impressive how much they do on such a shoestring budget. And so certainly quality of these institutions is going to matter for liberals. They would also then point to, right, as I was saying, the idea that liberalism is much more optimistic, cooperation is possible. There has been a lot of cooperation. Maybe it doesn't make the news as much because it's not as interesting, right? Or it's not going to be as splashy as the conflict, but there's cooperation that happens every day, all the time, right? So all of these articles are pointing to international institutions or international organizations where states have come together and tried to work. So the first one's talking about a meeting that the United States skipped, but a lot of other countries were there. This one was, they were talking a little bit about the EU, the European Union, but also the G20 and leading states that are part of the G20. The second one's talking more about the European Union and the role of Germany in coming to lead the European Union in all of its cooperation in the pandemic. And the third one's talking about the African Union. So there are lots of different forums, lots of different international organizations in the world where states do work together every day, right? So liberalism is going to look for the more optimistic side of the news here. Think about trade a little bit. You know, trade has been disrupted by the pandemic. Trade has gone down since the pandemic hit. And that makes sense, right? Because all of the economies of the world have gone down as well. People are buying less stuff, and that means they're buying less stuff from abroad. And so trade has gone down. Now, the first article here is dealing with China and Africa, right, as a continent. And so this one is pointing to the fact that China is the largest investor in Africa, right, as a continent, as a single state. China is the largest investor overall for the whole continent. That relationship has been, some tension has been interjected into it. Now, there was already tension there, but more tension has been interjected since the pandemic. And not just because of, in general, economies going down. This one is pointing to the idea that, you know, these relationships can be affected by a lot of things. One thing that has affected it is that China has been, you know, rounding up a lot of people from different African countries, or some people from Nigeria, some people from Togo, so different countries, right, and taking them from their homes and treating them differently than Chinese citizens. And so there's been a lot of diplomatic tension from the different countries who have been affected by that in Africa, right, trying to get the Chinese government to stop those kinds of practices in the name of the pandemic. If you're a minority in China, you have a good reason to be worried right now, right? China's prosecuting a genocide against its Muslim minority population. So if you are not the majority in China, you have good reason to be worried. The other piece of this is that for China, you know, it has in the G20, right? The G20, the group of 20 large 20 democratic or wealthy states, they have come together, 20 most wealthy states, and they've decided that there should be a moratorium or a halt to debt repayments from African countries until the end of the year, right? So much as, you know, there was a halt on paying rent, right, in some countries during the course of the pandemic, or at least for a while to give people a break. The same thing is true for countries, right? So Africa has many debts, right, and many loans that have been taken out, and they wanted to put a halt on payments until the end of the year. China didn't want to do it. So that's increased the tension there too. So the pandemic has certainly had an effect on trade in those relationships and had some intensity, right, added in. Now, we hope, of course, though, that there will be plenty of time for more cooperation to develop. We have seen cooperation, particularly among scientists, and that should give us a lot of hope. And liberals would point to that too. So the second article is saying, you know, we hope that there is going to be cooperation because that's the only way we're going to get out of this mess, right? So for liberalism, we've got a bit of a more optimistic approach, but definitely emphasizing the importance of trade and international institutions. On to the third one here for constructivism. We've got a different approach that I'll give you thinking about constructivism. So for this one, as it says, the world is socially constructed. So this means that, you know, the meanings that we have for different terms, the ideas that we hold as being acceptable, the way we think actors in the world ought to behave, all of that stuff is made up, right? We make up our languages, we make up what we deem to be acceptable behavior. All of that stuff is constructed through history and through the interaction of different actors. And so for constructivism, they're looking at all kinds of actors, not just states. We're looking at all kinds of actors, including individuals. Individuals can be really important. We're emphasizing ideas, right? And how ideas can be shaped by different actors and how they can change over time, sometimes over the long term, but sometimes really quickly ideas can change too. So we're looking at the importance of ideas, the importance of identity in particular as a kind of idea, and how not only states identify, but as individuals identify. And we'll talk about subgroups within countries here as well. So, you know, actors in international politics can care about more than just power and more than just money, right? They can care about their reputation, right? As an idea, how they're seen in different countries want to be seen in different ways, right? And they can care about ethics too, right? Now, the idea of ethics and what is right and wrong can change over time. We know that that has changed over time, right? And will continue to change over time, but they can care about more than the things that realism and liberalism point to. Okay, so if we use this perspective, we'll find even more different stories. So for one thing, I told you for constructivism, we're looking at actors more than just states, right? We're looking at all kinds of actors. For example, we should talk about Bill Gates. Bill Gates and Melinda Gates have put a ton of money into world health in general. And I told you, right, the US is having its beef with the World Health Organization and looking at freezing its payments to the World Health Organization. As that happens, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation will become the largest contributor to the World Health Organization, which we should see as notable, right? They are not a country, but the largest contributor to world health, right, to this international institution. So constructivism is right to say, you know, that more than just states matter. And this isn't a new phenomenon, right? Like Carnegie back in the day funded the construction of the Peace Palace, where the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is held. Rockefeller and his family funded the UN headquarters and the land where it is in New York. So this is not a new phenomenon. Okay, thinking about language a bit on this slide, right, and how ideas can develop very quickly and change very quickly. The article on the left here is talking about the phrase social distancing. This has become a part of our everyday lives now. Everybody knows what social distancing means. Is talking about where that phrase came from and on the history of it, which is important to understand, right? That this phrase referred to as a euphemism for class for a while, right? For economic classes and having social distance between economic classes. It's been used to talk about racism, or well, to talk about racial classes and the distance between racial classes. During the AIDS pandemic, it was used to talk about, right, stereotypically, having distance between people who were seen to be more risky. And you can think about all of the morality, I guess, you know, infused in that, or in the troubled ideas of morality at the time, and how it was laden with those stereotypes at the time. And so this phrase didn't come out of nowhere, although it kind of feels like that now. It has a history to it, and how we see this phrase has changed over time. So constructivists are going to be interested in tracing those kinds of changes. The article on the right is talking about language too. This one is talking about Trump and the way that he's talked about the virus. He has used different terms like the China flu and the Kung flu, right? That's the most recent term. That's the one being talked about here by NPR. And just like we talked about last week, it's very important to use it in the official scientific terms for thinking about the pandemic. The reason constructivists would say that Trump is using this language, it's purposeful, right? It's about scapegoating. It's about getting people who listen to him to blame China for the flu rather than blaming his administration for the handling of the pandemic. I think, did I say handling the flu, right? And the virus. Not a scientist, but they're trying to get China to blame China for the handling of the virus, or where it came from, rather than the administration, right? So language is really important for thinking about politics here and blaming. Another thing that I'll pull up here for constructivism, or that I'll point to, is again thinking about not only the impact on the pandemic, but also things that have not been impacted by the pandemic. So in the summer and through today, right, we're having a big moment of racial reckoning in the United States, right? Lots of conversations that have happened and lots of protests that have happened. And those protests are not confined to the United States. In fact, like more than 60 countries around the world have protested during the summer in solidarity with Black Americans, right? And so as this has happened, right, it's important to consider that the pandemic didn't stop these protests from happening. Despite the need to stay home and be away from each other, protests happened anyways. And so when we think about norms, right, and what people hold to be important, we want to consider the barriers or lack of barriers, right, barriers that are overcome to supporting those kinds of ideas. So constructivists would be interested in all of that. And then the last big paradigm that I'll talk about would be critical theories, or big umbrella. So we've got a lot of different theories that you could group under this idea. So I'll talk about a couple here. So here under critical theories, we're going to agree with constructivists that the world is socially constructed, that our reality is shaped by the interactions that individuals have with each other, and that these things can change over time. We're specifically interested in critiquing social hierarchies under the critical theories, and critiquing, right, power dynamics, right? Who has power over who else, right? And how that has changed over time and how that will continue to change, hopefully to being more equitable. So we got a couple of variants here. Under critical race theory, of course, we're talking about racism and the history of white supremacy, history of slavery, and how all of these things have shaped the history of the world going forward. Colonialism, history of imperialism, all of those things can fit into this conversation. The picture here is from an article from Foreign Policy over the summer. So like a lot of other fields, international relations, very late to the game here, is trying to reckon with racism in the field. And so this article is talking about that. For feminism, we're going to be thinking about differences in power between men and women around the world, and hierarchies, right? Thinking about gender and sexuality under feminism. And then for Marxism, thinking about economic class, right? And so how power is different by countries that have more wealth than others, as well as individuals and groups that have more wealth than others. All of these things intersect, right? It's very common to see stories that are going to talk about all of these at once. So you'll see that as I talk about some of the articles that I pulled out for these. So for this one, we're thinking just about within the United States first, and then I'll expand internationally. So hopefully you guys have been paying attention or thinking about these issues as we've gone through the pandemic, but people in the United States have not been affected evenly, right, by the pandemic. We know that racial minorities in the United States have been experiencing much more dire consequences because of the pandemic, both economically and in terms of health, right? And so these two articles are pointing at just two examples. The one on the left, particularly thinking about for Black Americans, and the one on the right, particularly thinking about Native American communities in the United States. We can expand outwards though, right? Because race, you know, is a concept that is a worldwide, right? And racism is an issue that is worldwide. And of course, here it's also going to intersect with economic class. So this particular article, or it's this story, audio story from NPR from July. It's an interview with Harriet Washington. If you haven't heard of her, I really recommend some of her work. Her book, Medical Apartheid, I assigned for my modern political thought class. So she is a bioethicist, and here she is talking about the ethics of medical trials. Particularly Oxford University of the UK is leading research on vaccines. They're doing a lot of this research in South Africa, in Brazil, right, in developing countries. There's a long history of this, long history of the UK with this, a long history with the United States with this. The US has a big history of testing new medicines on minorities within the United States, as well as people within territories of the United States like Puerto Rico. There's a lot of problems that go along with this, right? Because a lot of this stuff, we're trying to move as fast as we can on testing vaccines, and that means some of it's not going to be safe, and that people might be bearing the brunt of consequences that they wouldn't be bearing if they weren't of a particular country in this case, right? And so South Africans turned out to protest about these vaccines being tested by Oxford University. So this is one article. getting an international perspective on some of these issues. Two more things to think about with economic class and race, in this case intersecting, would be thinking about stereotypes and wanting to avoid those. And so both of these articles are dealing with developing countries that according to common Western stereotypes, you might not think about these countries being leaders in global health. But in this case, they have been, right, in the pandemic. So on the left-hand side, talking about Vietnam and its success in handling the pandemic, and on the right, Rwanda, right? And I like on the right-hand side, they're directly comparing Rwanda to Ohio, right? Rwanda's done much better in handling the pandemic than Ohio was. And so again, with the critical theories, we're trying to critique, right? And we want to critique and think about stereotypes and how they can really be wrong, right? And making sure we're aware of stereotypes as they exist. Next one here, moving a little bit into feminism and thinking about gender. Of course, one of the big stories for gender would be, thinking about, this is calling it the second crisis, the brunt of childcare that's being borne by women around the world. It's again an international issue, that as kids aren't in school and as people are having to stay home from work, that women are, doing the majority of childcare and household management. And that this is a crisis because this means that these women are able to work less and able to attend school less. Right. And so this article is making the argument that we may well see the effects of this pandemic on women worldwide for decades to come. A couple more stories bringing gender into the mix here. The first one here is talking about medical inequalities in treating men and women, and how most medical studies are centered around men, whereas men and women have different bodies and are affected differently by treatment and drugs and that sort of thing. It's important to think about, right? Because we already know that men and women are reacting differently to the virus, right? And so we want to make sure that gender is taken into account as research is being done. The second article is by Rebecca Solnit, popular philosopher in the United States, and she's talking about masculinity and masks in the US, right? That we know that women, ironically, although they're the less affected by the virus, it seems, are wearing masks at a much higher rate. And so she's tying this into the idea of masculinity, and that men feel more threatened, or their masculinity feels threatened by wearing masks. We'll have to go forward and think about if there are international versions of this as well. She's talking about mainly about the United States. And finally, the last story that I've got here on this slide is thinking about the question of whether or not women leaders are handling the virus better than men. I could have pulled 20 different articles on this topic. It's been kind of a hot topic over the course of the pandemic. But countries like New Zealand, Germany, being led by women, and some people are asking, is the reason that these countries are doing better is because there's a difference in those leaders? All important questions to ask. The last story I've got here is one that I wanted to pull in just because it's one that you might not have heard of or thought about before. Another issue for feminism worldwide that is reproductive justice, and there are all sorts of issues that go along with that. And I came across this story and saved it early on in the pandemic because I hadn't thought about it to that point, so you might not have thought about it either. The business of international surrogacy has grown a lot in recent years. So that, there is a surrogate across borders in another country who's bearing the child. And then the couple who is going to have the child goes to the other country to get the child once it's born. Of course, once lockdowns happened, right, nobody could travel anymore. And so you had lots of babies who were born whose parents were in another country, and this led to a lot of problems. In this particular article, they're talking about surrogates in Ukraine, but actually the United States is where most of these surrogates are, because the US has really lax laws about surrogacy compared to most of the rest of the world. So there are a lot of babies born in the United States that were to be, right, who their parents were abroad or elsewhere and couldn't get here to get, be able to meet their children. Okay, so I've gone through a whole bunch of different articles here. Hopefully I've been able to give you a framework for thinking about all of these news stories as they come in. And I've been able to give you some different ideas for addressing the effect of the pandemic on international relations. I hope that was my goal. So I've taken you through a whole bunch of stuff very quickly, but I'm happy to stick around and answer questions until I have class, if you guys have questions.
Thanks, Dr. Mobley. There are a few questions in the chat that I'll go ahead and read. and we can go over, and everyone else, please feel free to go ahead and type your questions in the chat if you have any. And Dr. Mobley, you and I can maybe both kind of look at them, and I'll read a couple here out loud. So one of the questions is in terms of weakness, is the US actually getting weaker, or does the US seem weaker because China is stronger? How have the actions of our government affected the United States' strengths? Is it more government affected? Is it more the virus and the fact that we have the most cases and deaths that is making us weaker, or is it the actions of our government during the pandemic that is making us weaker?
All right, Dr. Kitchens, you got a lot of questions there. So with the first one, you have honed in on an issue that separates realists and liberals. So for realists, what they care about is relative power. For liberals, what they care about is absolute power. Okay, so the two are different, and they're different ways of thinking about power. Since realists are so threatened basically by other countries, they don't care about how much power they have just in real terms. They care about how much power they have in relation to everybody else. So if I'm a realist, I care about having more power than you. I don't really care how many tanks I have. I just want more than you have, right? And so looking at it from a relative perspective, the US has in fact declined in power by just about any way you slice it, because right, if we are up here, China is getting closer. And so even though the US economy in general has gotten stronger over time and continues to get stronger in the big picture, and even though we spend more and more in our military, China has grown much faster, right? And so in relation to each other, they've gotten closer, even though the US hasn't, actually dipped down that much. For liberals, they care about absolute power, right? And that's just how well off you are in terms of power, in terms of economics. In that sense, the US hasn't really gotten weaker, right? Because we still have, again, overall, a pretty big economy, very big economy, a high, per capita wealth, huge. We spend way more on our military than any other country, right? Than the next dozen countries combined. So in absolute sense, we're fine, right? But it's that relative sense that gives anxiety to realists. For the rest of your question, yes, I would say that if you go back and think about world leadership, there's the article that is under liberalism, right? This happens with each administration. It's not direct, it's not super divided by Republicans and Democrats, although somewhat, that some presidents want to be more involved in the world and some want to be less involved in the world. Trump wants to be less involved in the world. So we've pulled out of all sorts of international agreements, international organizations. That may be reversed by a different president, right? And the US may become more active. So that part can kind of change with each administration. But the big trends, right, that China's economy has just continued to grow. It's continuing to spend more on its military. That's not going to change with each US administration.
Thank you, Kayce. And actually, I have more tanks than you. I just bought them from IKEA and I still have to build them.
Assembled them. Well, that means I'm going to be building more tanks. Get ready for the arms race.
Right here, Dr. Mobley, I have a question from Richard Hall.
Okay.
He says, is there a correlation between these theories in our news media? Realism and Fox, Liberalism, CNN, Constructivism and MSNBC, critical theories, PBS?
Yeah, that's a great question. Off the top of my head, I would say that may well be true. I would assume, that Fox, because it caters more to Republicans are more worried about security generally. I'm painting in really broad strokes. They may have more, realist aimed kind of pieces. That I would have to look and see if there's been any research done on that about the content or the slant of the articles in particular, but I think that would probably be true. It makes sense to me. I would say in general, though, that news media are going to slant to being more sensationalist, right? And so the allure of realism is that people are, keyed up to be afraid all the time. And so if you're afraid of other countries, if you're afraid of other states, and then the news plays into that, well, you're going to watch more, and they want you to watch more for advertising money. And so I think in general, right, you're going to see more play among more realist-minded approaches. Let's see, I'm trying to read, I think Tahira had a question here. So I haven't seen study of this just yet, but it seems that video footage of people refusing to wear masks tends to be heavily focused on women. Do you have any sense of how that may be received in terms of international relations? I don't, because what I'll say is, from my understanding, in most other countries, a lot of other countries, mask wearing has been more enforced, right? In the US, we have the problem of federalism and the problem of, the really strong sense of individualism. And so we have a lot of people who aren't wearing masks, both because it's not been being enforced by the government and because people feel entitled to not wear masks if they don't want to. Whereas in a lot of other countries, you have governments that have been more willing to enforce masks, as well as people who are more, in general, community minded. So I don't know, though. That's interesting. I'm not sure if in other countries, that slant of looking more at women not wearing masks has also been true. I'm not sure, but that's a great question.
I also want to go ahead real quickly and introduce to everyone Dr. Walker. She's recently joined us as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and she's also going to be an assistant professor in our Communications and Media Arts department. So I wanted to go ahead and take a quick moment to introduce her, and we're super happy to have her. It's going to be super fun and great to work with her.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. I was sorry to have missed last week's lecture, but I'm going to try to join these each time they're occurring, and I can't tell you how grateful I am for the depth of perspective and remembering, though much of the way we conceive these things is steeped in Western philosophies and Western ways of viewing the world that we call international. There's still such a great breadth of different perspectives here. So thank you so much for that. And thanks for your answer to my question.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm sure I'll see all of you around.
Yeah, if eventually in person, but until then, virtually.
Yes, I'll see you around Zoom, I should say.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, there's another question. Why is the US, according to these theories, why has the US abdicated its role as a leader? That's a great question too. It depends on which theory you're looking at. For realists, right, they would say that international organizations don't matter that much, right? The UN can't enforce whatever laws it passes. And so it just doesn't really matter that much. So why would you put the effort into leading it if, if it's not really doing that much for you at the time, if you're not getting that much out of it? For liberals, they're going to be a little bit more vexed by this because they believe that international institutions can matter a lot. I would say, going back to the example of the World Health Organization, though, not all international organizations are built the same. Some are more useful than others, depending on just what the states put into them. If you're only funding the World Health Organization at the level of one hospital, it's not going to be very useful overall because it just doesn't have the resources. And so I'd go back to that idea if you're coming from it from a liberal perspective, right? That these international organizations aren't being supported to the level that they could be really useful. So therefore, maybe it's not as useful to be in the leadership position. I would also say that, I didn't really touch on domestic politics driving international politics very much. That's a whole other thing. I just didn't have enough time. But certainly a lot of international relations scholars would just point to the domestic politics of the United States and saying, under this administration, particularly under this president, that's why the US has pulled out, because this administration didn't want to be part of the international organizations, right? And so you certainly could just make that argument as well. I think that's the best argument to make. But that's, like I said, there are so many perspectives and not very much time to talk about them all.
All right. If there are any other questions, it looks like I think you got through all of them. And of course, anytime you all can certainly, I'll let Dr. Mobley, if you wouldn't mind putting your email, maybe down in the chat. Everyone can also find that on the website, or email me and I can put you in contact with her. But I think this would be fantastic. If any of the other professors on here, Dr. Kitchen, since you've already done yours, and Dr. Walker, if you wouldn't mind putting your emails in the chat, and if anyone has any other questions or would like to continue any of these conversations, speaking for them, I'm sure that you are more than welcome to email them or contact them and reach out. So I want to thank everyone again for coming, and definitely a special thanks to Dr. Mobley for taking her time ahead of time, preparing for this and for everything, and giving this lecture. So I'm super excited to continue these. We have these scheduled every Tuesday. So join us next week, and every other Tuesday that's possible for everyone to join us at 11:30 through the same Zoom link that we have. And we're going to continue these lectures and the talks and everything in all sorts of different areas and subjects. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for all the questions and coming out.
All right, thanks guys.
I was just going to hang on in case there were any other questions or anything, but.
Sure.
Oh, Jan, you're muted.
That's because I was eating chips before and I didn't want to broadcast my chip eating. I missed Carolyn's presentation last Tuesday. Is there a way to access that?
It's on Facebook, right?
Yeah, Coach, it's on Facebook still because we did Facebook Live. And I think it's still on there. And then also, I believe we are posting them. I think Emily Luke is posting them onto our YouTube channel.
Okay.
They are on the YouTube channel.
Okay, yeah. So
Okay.
a couple of different ways you can get them. I'm sure you could always get on the phone with her and get a hold of her.
Yeah, I could. I was trying not to bother her too much. I was trying to sneak around the back door.
Right. So yeah, I would say Facebook's probably the easiest, or get on YouTube.
Okay.
But yeah, it was fantastic. So I'm sure you'd like.
Kayce, thanks so much, and Roan, thank you.
Yeah.
I've been
Absolutely.
Yep.
in and out with stuff going on today, but it was really great, and I appreciate it so much.
No problem.
Sure. These are going
Thank
great.
you to everybody again. I
everyone.
enjoyed it. Appreciate it. Bye.
Y'all have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Bye, everyone.